The sun was hanging low and tired over the dry plains of Montana Territory, spilling gold across the land like the last breath of summer. When the rancher rode through that stretch of loneliness that only the West could know, his horse's hooves pressing sorrow into the dust. He'd been trailing strays since dawn, moving slow, just him and the wind, when a flicker of color caught his eye by the creek bend, something that didn't belong to the earth or the sage. He reined in, squinting beneath the brim of his hat, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. There, half hidden by brittle grass and the shadow of a cottonwood, sat a girl no older than 13. Her dress torn at the sleeve, her face hollow but steady, one hand resting on the still body of a woman, whose hair fluttered faintly in the breeze. The rancher felt something in his chest shift like a board come loose on an old porch. Death wasn't new to him. He'd buried more than he cared to count, but there was something about the quiet way the girl sat, guarding what was left of her world, that made the emptiness inside him stir. The land around them stretched wide and unforgiving, buzzards already circling high above, the wind moving lazy through the brush. And he could tell from a single look that the woman had been gone a while. The girl must have kept vigil through the long days, too scared or too proud to leave her mother's side, her eyes dry, not from lack of tears, but from having spent them all. The rancher dismounted slow, boots sinking into the soft earth near the creek, and though the ground smelled of dust and death, there was something sacred in that stillness, something too fragile for words. He thought of his own wife, gone near 5 winters now, and how he'd stood in the cold watching the preacher's mouth move without hearing a single word, his heart split between holding on and letting go. Maybe that's why he didn't turn away like most men would. Maybe that's why he couldn't. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat, and the mare pawed nervously at the dirt, sensing what men often couldn't say aloud. He looked around. The tracks told him plenty. A wagon wheel broken not far off, a trail of small footprints circling back to where the woman lay, a patch of dried blood half hidden beneath the grass. They'd been headed somewhere, maybe a mining town, maybe just away, and the West had decided otherwise. The rancher's hands were rough, his shoulders bent by years of toil and quiet grief. But he moved with care as he knelt by the woman, whispering something only he could hear. A wordless promise that the dead would be tended to proper. The girl didn't flinch or move, just kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, like she could still see something there worth believing in. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror mostly. The air carried the smell of sage and sunburnt earth, a scent that clung to sorrow, like it had nowhere else to go. He didn't ask who she was or where she came from. Out here, stories were written in silence, and the land itself spoke louder than words. He took off his hat, letting the wind cool the sweat on his brow, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the pull of something that wasn't work or habit. It was duty, the kind that came from the soul, the kind that asked a man to remember what it meant to be human. As the sun slid lower and the sky caught fire in shades of red and copper, he knew he couldn't ride off and leave her there. Not in a world that had already taken too much. He set about building a small cairn of stones beside the creek, each rock placed steady and sure, and though the girl said nothing, she watched him with eyes that held the weight of someone far older. When the work was done, he stood over the grave, dusted off his hands, and looked up at the endless horizon where the stars were beginning to show. And in that vast quiet, something changed inside him. The emptiness that had haunted him since the day he'd buried his wife eased just a little, replaced by a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt since he'd heard laughter in his house. The girl still sat where she was, and though the night air grew cold, she didn't shiver, didn't cry. She just looked at the mound of earth beside her like it was the last piece of home she'd ever know. The rancher knew what that felt like. He'd spent years staring at an empty chair, listening for a voice that never came. He turned back to his horse, but before mounting, he looked once more at the girl, and something deep inside him settled like the dust after a long ride. The West was a hard place. It took what it wanted and gave nothing easy, but sometimes when a man least expected it, it offered a second chance, wrapped not in comfort, but in need. And though he didn't yet know her name, or where she'd come from, he knew this: he couldn't let the night take her too. He didn't speak as he gathered his reins, just looked out over the land that had swallowed so many dreams. And in that dying light, he made a decision that didn't need words. The girl rose slow, like someone who'd forgotten what her legs were for. And for the first time, he noticed the tremble in her shoulders, the dirt on her cheeks that wasn't just dust but the dried trail of grief. She clutched something in her hand, a small ribbon, faded blue, and though the rancher couldn't know what it meant, he understood enough to know it was everything she had left. The night came fast, the kind that wrapped around a man and tested his will, and he led the horse close, gesturing for her to climb up. She hesitated, casting one last look at the mound of earth beside the creek, then stepped forward, moving like someone half awake from a long, hard dream. The rancher swung into the saddle behind her, the weight of her presence strange but steady, and together they rode out into the fading light. The plains stretched wide and silver under the rising moon, coyotes calling from the far hills, and the rhythm of the horses' hooves on dry earth was the only sound that dared disturb the quiet. He felt the girl lean slightly as the wind brushed her hair across his sleeve, and for a moment he remembered the small weight of his own boy before fever took him years ago, remembered the warmth of family and the way a home sounded when laughter lived there. He hadn't thought of those days in a long time. Out here, memories were like ghosts, best not to call them by name. But the girl's silence spoke louder than words ever could, and he found himself riding softer, like he didn't want to wake whatever fragile peace had settled between them. The stars came out thick and bright, a blanket of old light stretching forever, and he rode by their glow, following the faint trail that led back to his land. The wind was cold but not cruel. It felt cleaner somehow, like the world had taken a breath after too long holding it in. He could feel the land changing underfoot, the dry grass giving way to softer soil, the smell of water and pine drifting closer, and by the time they reached the fence line of his ranch, dawn was crawling slow over the horizon. The house stood quiet, grey in the half-light, its windows dark, its walls holding years of silence. He dismounted and helped her down, though she moved like someone who didn't trust the ground beneath her yet, and he led her inside without a word. The place was plain, wood floors, a table scarred by time, a fire cold in the hearth, but it felt like a church after a long storm. He lit the lantern, the small flame chasing shadows across the room, and though the girl stood near the doorway like a skittish colt, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe hope, that told him she hadn't forgotten what safety felt like, only misplaced it for a while. He left her standing there and stepped outside again, the dawn wind brushing past him like a hand from the past, and he stared out at the land he'd worked alone for years. The sun was slow to rise, spilling gold across the fields, and in that light he saw what he'd been missing all along, not just company, but reason. He'd lived too long counting the days by chores and seasons, waiting for something he couldn't name, and now it had found him in the shape of a girl too young to bear the weight she carried. He went back in, set the kettle on the stove, and as steam began to whisper, he felt the house change. It wasn't much, but it was alive again, the kind of alive that comes from purpose, from remembering you're needed. She hadn't spoken, and he didn't ask her to. There were some hurts too deep for words, and both of them knew that kind of silence. When the smell of coffee filled the air, he caught sight of her by the window, her fingers tracing the glass as if she were trying to memorize the view. And he thought how the world could be both cruel and kind in the same breath. Outside, the land stretched on forever, and somewhere out there the grave by the creek would fade beneath the grass, but not from her heart. He reckoned that kind of loss never did fade, it just learned to walk beside you. He didn't know yet what tomorrow would bring, whether she'd stay or whether she'd run when the road called again, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for something to end. The morning light fell warm across the floorboards, and he felt it deep in his bones. That quiet kind of peace that doesn't shout or promise. It just settles in and stays. Somewhere in the distance, a lark began to sing, and he found himself listening, really listening like he hadn't since before the sickness took everything from him. Maybe the West wasn't done teaching him after all. Maybe it still had mercy left to give. The girl turned from the window then, her eyes catching the light, and though she didn't speak, he could see it there, the faintest glimmer of something like trust. And that was enough. He didn't need words, didn't need thanks or tears. The world had already said what needed saying when it set their paths to cross beneath that dying sun. And as the day began again over the endless land, the rancher understood that sometimes salvation didn't come in thunder or prayer. It came quietly, in the form of a lost child, reminding a broken man that life, no matter how hard, still had room for kindness. The days that followed settled slow and quiet over the ranch, like dust after a storm, and the girl moved through them as though learning the world all over again, her steps cautious at first, her eyes always measuring the distance between fear and safety. And the widower rancher, who'd once counted his life by the sound of wind in the grass and the creak of a lonely porch, found himself watching her the way a man studies the weather, not expecting change, but knowing it could come. The land itself seemed to soften around them. Morning light spilled through the cottonwoods, turning the dew on the fence rails to silver, and each sunrise came with a hush that felt almost merciful. He rose early, same as always, to mend fence and tend stock, and she began following him without being asked, quiet as a shadow, but steady, her small hands learning the language of work, the way a rope ought to coil, the rhythm of hooves in the corral, the patience it took to calm a restless colt. She hardly spoke, yet the air between them filled with unspoken understanding, a rhythm of shared purpose that said more than words ever could. At first he worried she'd fade beneath the weight of sorrow, that the silence of the open plains would swallow her like it had nearly swallowed him. But bit by bit he saw color come back to her cheeks, and the stiffness ease from her shoulders, and the sound of her small footsteps across the porch in the early light became the heartbeat of the place. He caught himself setting an extra plate at the table without thinking, leaving the lamp burning longer than he used to, finding reasons to fix things that weren't broken just so the hammering would draw her near. The ranch changed with her. Even the horses seemed to breathe easier, and the air carried something gentle that hadn't lived there since the day his wife's laughter left the walls. Sometimes, when dusk came rolling in pink and gold across the sky, he'd stand by the gate and watch her sit by the paddock fence, a notebook in her lap, scratching words he couldn't read from where he stood, and he'd think how remarkable it was that the same world that could break a person could also teach them to mend. He didn't ask about her past anymore. The West had its own way of erasing footprints, and what mattered was the trail ahead. Yet in quiet moments, he'd see her glance toward the horizon, the direction of the creek, and he'd know her heart still traveled there now and again. He never told her not to. He understood that remembering was a kind of keeping faith. What surprised him most was how she brought life back to things he'd long given up on. The old piano in the corner she cleaned one afternoon until its keys gleamed like new ivory. The neglected garden behind the barn that soon showed stubborn green shoots pushing through the soil. When he heard her humming one evening, soft as twilight, he realized the house was no longer haunted. It had become home again. The seasons rolled on, carrying them from the chill of early spring into the amber heat of summer, and the rhythm of work bound them together like braided rope, steady, dependable, enduring. The girl grew stronger, the man lighter, and though neither spoke of love or kinship, both carried it quietly, each morning's sunrise sealing it unspoken. And in that wide and silent country, where grief had once built walls too high to climb, the sound of a child's laughter began to echo again, stitching two broken lives into something whole. Then one late summer afternoon, the sky began to bruise along the ridgeline, clouds stacking dark and mean over the prairie, the kind that smell of iron and warning. and the wind turned restless through the cottonwoods like it had something to say. He'd spent enough years in this country to know trouble when he felt it in his bones. So he moved quick, driving the cattle towards shelter, the girl at his heels without needing to be told. Lightning split the horizon wide, and the air went white with dust as thunder rolled over the land like cannon fire. The storm came sudden, fierce and personal, the sort that tested what a man and a home were made of. Rain hit in hard, slanting sheets, drumming the roof, flooding the lower fields, and for a moment he feared the creek would rise and take the bridge clean away. He saw the girl through the curtain of water, hair plastered to her face, wrestling a gait that wouldn't hold, and the sight tore through him. Small but unyielding, refusing to run. Together, they fought the storm like two souls against the whole of creation. Rope burning their hands, boots sinking in the mud, until at last the wind broke, the clouds tore apart, and the land exhaled in weary silence. When it was over, they stood soaked to the bone. The barn still standing, the herd safe, the sky bleeding pale light through the wreck of clouds. And in that moment, he knew she wasn't a guest on his land anymore. She belonged to it, same as he did. They trudged back to the porch, where the rainwater pooled in the boards, and the smell of wet earth rose sweet and clean, and something unspoken passed between them, solid as a handshake, gentle as a promise. That night, when the storm's echo still murmured through the hills, he sat by the fire and thought how years of solitude had carved him hollow, and how the simple presence of that stubborn girl had filled the emptiness, like the first green after drought. He realized the ache he'd carried for his wife and son had softened into gratitude, not because loss hurt less, but because love had found a way to live again through new hands, new eyes, new laughter. Outside, the world shone washed and newborn under a shy moon, and the scent of rain drifted through the open door, mixing with the smoke of the hearth. He looked at the small pair of boots drying by the fire and felt the weight of time shift, like the earth itself had tilted toward mercy. The next morning, sunlight broke clear and golden over the range, lighting every blade of grass like it was spun gold. And as they stepped outside to face the day's work, he saw her smile for the first time, a quiet, uncertain thing, but real, and it went through him like sunrise through glass. From that day on, the ranch no longer felt like a refuge for the broken. It felt like a beginning. The seasons turned as they always did, with the slow patience of the land, and the years began to shape themselves around their quiet rhythm, like a river bending to its banks. The ranch thriving under the steady labor of two hearts that had learned to heal by working side by side. The girl grew taller, stronger, her once guarded eyes bright now with something fierce and free. And the widower rancher grew older, his shoulders stooped, but his spirit lighter, the weight of grief worn smooth by time and kindness. Each morning brought its share of chores, and each evening brought a kind of peace he thought was gone forever. The simple grace of sharing supper, the sound of another soul moving through the house. The laughter that sometimes rose unbidden when she teased the old hound or spilled milk across the table and looked at him with mock fear. The West around them remained what it always was, hard, vast and untamed, but inside the small fence of that homestead, something softer had taken root. Folks in the nearest town came to know them as family, never mind the lack of blood between them. The blacksmith would tip his hat when the girl rode in for supplies, and the storekeeper would smile and say how much she favored her pa, though neither of them ever corrected the word. The rancher sometimes wondered what his late wife would think if she could see the place now, sunflowers in the garden, a fresh coat of white on the porch rail, the laughter of youth echoing where sorrow once lingered, and he reckoned she'd be smiling somewhere beyond the sunset, content that her man had learned to live again. On quiet nights he'd sit out beneath the stars, pipe smoke curling into the dark, listening to the hum of crickets and the faint sound of her voice, singing some tune she'd learned long ago. And he'd feel that rarest of things, a heart at rest. There came a spring when she was nearly grown, when the valley filled with wildflowers and the air smelled of new beginnings. And he realized she was no longer the frightened child by the creek, but a young woman ready to ride her own trail. Pride and sorrow mixed in him like rain and dust. But he knew a man's duty wasn't to hold on. It was to make sure those he cared for had wings enough to leave when the time came. One morning she found him by the corral mending a gate, the sun painting his face in gold, and though words weren't spoken, the understanding passed easy between them. She would go one day soon, maybe to teach in town, maybe to see what lay beyond the horizon, and he would stay, tending the land that had given him back his soul. But he wasn't afraid of the quiet anymore. When she rode out for the first time alone, the land stretching wide and welcoming before her, he stood at the fence with the same old hat pulled low and watched her disappear into the dawn, his chest heavy yet peaceful. He turned then, hearing the wind whistle through the open fields, and smiled to himself, a small, knowing smile that came from deep down where pain and love had learned to live side by side. The ranch felt alive again, full of echoes and promise, and somewhere beyond the cottonwoods a lark began to sing, its voice lifting over the endless plains like a benediction. The widower looked up at the sky, the color of mercy, and whispered a thank you to whatever power had seen fit to bring a lost girl into his life, for in saving her he'd been saved too. And as the day stretched out before him bright and boundless, the story of their crossing lingered in the air like the scent of rain on dry earth, a quiet reminder that even in the rough country of the heart, kindness can still bloom, and family can be found where least expected.